Ciao a tutti e benvenuti. In questo video vi porto un'intervista davvero speciale. Abbiamo avuto il privilegio di parlare con tre massimi studiosi della Brigham Young University sul tema del Libro di Abramo, una delle rivelazioni più affascinanti ricevute dal profeta Joseph Smith. Il primo ospite è il professor Kerem Younestein, egittologo di fama internazionale con anni di esperienza nello studio dei papiri egizi e del contesto antico legato al Libro di Abramo. È stato anche direttamente coinvolto in scavi archeologici in Egitto, contribuendo con il suo lavoro sul campo alla comprensione storica e culturale dell'epoca. Abbiamo poi il professor John Gee, esperto in papirologia e profondo conoscitore dei testi antichi e religiosi dell'Antico Egitto, che ha dedicato gran parte della sua carriera allo studio del rapporto tra questi documenti e la restaurazione della Chiesa di Gesù Cristo. E infine il professor Richard Bennett, storico della Chiesa, che ci aiuta a comprendere le circostanze storiche in cui il libro di Abramo è emerso, approfondendo anche la figura di Antonio Lebolo, collezionista italiano da cui tutto ebbe inizio. Insieme a loro abbiamo esplorato il contesto storico, archeologico e dottrinale del Libro di Abramo, cercando di capire meglio che cosa significhi questo testo per la fede e la storia dei santi degli ultimi giorni. Buona visione. Thank you for coming. You came here in Torino in this week. We went around, we went to the Egyptian Museum, we went to Castellamonte. What was this for?
We were invited to come to celebrate great work of Antonio Lebolo, who found the papyri from which eventually the Book of Abraham was translated, and to honor his name and to remember the great Italian connection to the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Without Lebolo, we wouldn't have found or wouldn't have the papyri from which the Book of Abraham was translated by the prophet Joseph Smith.
What's the Book of Abraham?
The Book of Abraham are writings from the prophet Abraham, or the great patriarch Abraham, such an important figure in three world religions, and particularly important for us as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because of that covenant connection and our belief in the house of Israel and the gathering of the house of Israel that is part of that covenant. So these are writings of the book of that prophet that are handed down for generations, and then Joseph Smith is able to restore those to us that contain important doctrinal teachings for us.
Abraham, of course, received the records of the ancients. We read in Abraham chapter 1, verse 31, "But the records of the fathers, even the patriarchs, concerning the right of priesthood, the Lord my God preserved in mine own hands. Therefore a knowledge of the beginning of the creation, and also of the planets and of the stars, as they were made known unto the fathers, have I kept even unto this day." Abraham was like a Moroni, taking the records of the ancients and compiling them into his book. "And I shall endeavor to write some of these things upon this record for the benefit of my posterity." That's us. So it's a record that goes back to the very beginning. And it speaks to the creation of our premortal life, of the meaning of this existence upon the earth. This is my work and my glory written large in the Book of Abraham.
That's fascinating, isn't it? That he kind of got all these writings from the beginning of time, all these records, and I like that he said it's for our profit, for our benefit. That's the reason we have scriptures, isn't it, in the first place, so that we can learn. And I guess one of the reasons we have prophets as well nowadays is that we can learn more. Ma qual è il ruolo di Antonio Lebolo, il ruolo nello specifico, negli scavi?
Lebolo, who was from Castellamonte, here in Italy, moves to Egypt in approximately 1818 to work with a friend of his, a long-term friend, Bernardino Drovetti. Drovetti was the French consul. Even though he's Italian, he's the French consul in Egypt. And after his first appointment as consular, he then begins to excavate for Egyptian antiquities under the direction and with the permission of the Egyptian government, the Pasha Muhammad Ali. Lebolo will work with Drovetti for a period of 3 years, from 1818 to 1821, excavating as Drovetti did in the tombs of various places in Egypt, primarily near Thebes, in the Valley of the Kings in that region of Egypt. And it's during that time that he will discover many mummies and papyri. And he will bring some of those mummies, as does Drovetti with a much larger collection, but Lebolo's collection is the one we focus on because Lebolo's collection will eventually come to Egypt, and then through over a period of several years, they will find their way from Trieste to New York City in 1833. They're taken on a kind of a tour of America for 2 years, from 1833 to 1835. In July of 1835, Joseph Smith receives them. The church will pay a large amount of money for them, and Joseph will then translate over a period of 7 years from the papyri into the Book of Abraham.
So Lebolo was a major figure in this sense that if he was the one that found and that he sold these papyri to get to the US. Ci sono quindi dei parallelismi tra l'antico Egitto e quello che c'è scritto nel libro di Abramo.
There are a number of them. So some of them are cultural. So the Book of Abraham mentions some Egyptian cultural practices. They talk about sacrifice after the manner of the Egyptians. We know a lot about that particular some of those sacrifices. Abraham's time is one of the few times when we've got historical texts mentioning them, archaeological evidence for them, and as well as prescriptive texts, legal texts that say when you would use this particular form. And Abraham's time period is the only time where we have all three of those at the same time. There are other ones that are, say, specific to Egypt. So Abraham is taught in the Book of Abraham in chapter 3. He's given this vision of what he's supposed to teach when he gets into Egypt. And some of the passages there make the best sense out of with a knowledge of the cultural practices and the beliefs at the time. For example, he talks about astronomy and planets and how if you get one planet above another until you get near to Kolob, and in the same way you have one spirit, another until you get to God. And there's a play on words. It's an Egyptian in there. The term for the planet is an ach, and the term for a spirit is an ech. And so you go from one ach above another to one ech above another. And that's a pun that we actually have even attested in Egyptian. And that's something that shows up in the Book of Abraham, even though it wasn't discovered by Egyptologists until much later. And so we have records at the time of at least a limited knowledge of the pre-existence among the Egyptians. So Abraham's teachings would have resonated there. And so most of those things that Abraham is revealed to the Lord have parallels in Egypt. Another historical one is he talks about the Egyptians were the blood of the Canaanites by birth. And when Abraham goes down into Egypt, that seems to be time when you have Canaanite rulers in Egypt. So there are lots of parallels that are subtle in the Book of Abraham. Do you have more you would like to add?
I'll maybe add a few. I think those are the more significant ones. I'll add some that are less important but interesting, and actually that much but is based on Dr. Guy's work, but little things like names of places, the plains of Olishem, and there are from that time period and in texts that are in Akkadian, an Ulisum, that is a place that's clearly in the area where we would expect this Olishem to be. Words that and I think it was you and Dr. Stephen Smoot who figured this out, but a word that is used for the elliptical of the sun. Only during Abraham's lifetime, the word that is used in Egyptian is the same word that we get used for the sun in the Book of Abraham, Sheneha. And lots of little things like that I've been working on, and that's furthering work that Dr. Guy did on what the priest who owned the papyrus that facsimile, the original, the facsimile one is a facsimile of, the kinds of things he was doing so we'd know what he would be interested in. And there are surprising parallels between the rituals he was performing, whether it be about creation, whether it be about protection from dangerous forces, that parallel with the story of the Book of Abraham, and a whole bunch of little things in the drawings about what each figure in the drawing might mean, or the names of the gods underneath the bed. Dr. Guy has an article on almost each of the 4 gods and how we find those names actually attested from the right time period and so on. There are so many little parallels that don't have theological significance in the same way that the levels of the spirits or intelligences in the sons do, but still just a fascinating parallels that can't be overlooked.
And so I just have this other question just came to mind. Are these things that Joseph Smith could have known?
We have looked at that. Some of the things that I discovered were based on, so for example, the human sacrifice. It was my dissertation advisor who discovered that. First published it in 1993, which is 150 years after. If you look at all of these things that we found, they weren't known in Joseph Smith's day. In fact, in Joseph Smith's day, although Champollion had made great progress toward the decipherment, no one could read an entire Egyptian text. That was done for the first time 7 years after Joseph Smith's death. So none of this was known then.
So thank you for the many things you just shared, because it's not just about the doctrinal parallels that can be found within our theology or the ancient theology as well, but it's historical, cultural, astronomical, and you name it. There's plenty of them.
It's not something that we would have if the Book of Abraham were fiction. They managed to get far too many things right from what was known in Joseph Smith's day, which is one of the arguments why it isn't fiction. If you're going to write a book and talk about details in a culture that nobody at the time knows anything about and expect that 150 years later they're going to find evidence to support it, that's a little hard to imagine how you're going to do that. Over time, you find out that things don't work. Not that they do.
Ho un'ultima domanda. Alcuni critici mettono in discussione la traduzione del Libro di Abrahamo. Quindi la domanda è: come rispondono gli studiosi della Chiesa? E se ci sono prospettive, quali sono le prospettive a riguardo?
My interest is less in the translation process, because the methodology of translation is a difficult discussion and debate and controversy to this day. It's the message of the Book of Abraham that's of most importance to me. The message of a divine creation and a divine purpose and a Christ-centered gospel. It speaks of the great council in heaven, Christ being the first, being chosen, and the second was angry and was thrust out because of his rebellion. The doctrines of the Book of Abraham are amazingly Christ-centered, that Christ would come to the earth and perform a remarkable atonement. And it was all there from the beginning, and we were there with them in that great council. And it gives great meaning to life. The Book of Abraham is a book of life, not of death, of life. And however Joseph Smith translated that book, it has more of the great doctrines of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints than perhaps any other book. You take away the Book of Abraham, you might even be taking away temple worship in this church. The gospel of Abraham is taught in the church and in the temples is so very real and so very powerful. So that's why we celebrate Lebolo for being an instrument in finding those manuscripts, those scrolls that came forth from the Book of Abraham. How Joseph translated is a question I'll leave to my good colleagues, but the message of the translation will last forever.
I would say when people are asking about the translation of the Book of Abraham and they're wondering if it's translated correctly, they are usually operating on misinformation or a misunderstanding or an assumption, because the question they are asking without realizing they're asking it or without realizing the assumption they're making is often when you look at the fragments that we still have and you translate them, do they say something about Abraham? The answer is no, they don't. But notice the assumption that they're making, that Joseph Smith is translating from the fragments we still have. When you look at those who knew Joseph Smith during his lifetime and what those eyewitnesses say, they say he's translating from a large roll. These are small fragments. We know that they were glued onto paper before any of those witnesses said that. So we know that these fragments were separate from that roll when they talk about Joseph translating from a large roll. So we know he's not translating from the fragments we have. So you can't actually ask the question or answer the question, how does what Joseph Smith translated match with the papyrus we have? Because that's not what he translated. And so it's a question that can't be answered, but so it's misinformation. So often people think that should tell them something about Joseph Smith when it can't, and they don't realize the wrong assumption that they made. And when you find people who say they are sure this is what he's translating from, basically they are saying, I know better than the people who were alive and knew Joseph Smith and saw things happening knew. It's a question that we can't answer, and yet people misunderstand it enough that it causes them problems. And so hopefully by giving this answer, we can clear up the misunderstandings.
I think that Dr. Bennett's perspective is very important. We realize what we have with the Book of Abraham. I think that the perspective articulated by Professor Muhlestein about it's a sort of bait and switch, since the ones who were there say this was a different text that was translated, and that's one that we don't have.
We don't have these because the rolls were lost, right?
We can trace some of what happened to these. We know that the rolls went to St. Louis and then to Chicago, and then in 1871, the museum that had the rolls was burned to the ground. So we can't even test the pieces that were the fragments of scrolls that were kept separately, and they had a separate trajectory, and they ended up back at the church. But we know those aren't the text. In some ways, you can look at the translation question. People don't want to look at what's actually in the Book of Abraham, and this way they gives them a way to try to talk about the Book of Abraham in a certain way without actually examining the text. And they talk about the text and how it was produced, but it turns out that we don't know exactly how Joseph Smith translated the text. All we know is that his scribe said it was done by direct inspiration from heaven. That's the only statement we have on it. And there have been a lot of arguments and discussions about other ways of knowing, but it turns out that they're not well-founded. If you don't want to actually deal with the text of the Book of Abraham, but you want to dismiss it, then this is asking about the translation is the route that they do that. But that's a way of avoiding reading the text itself. The text is the witness, and it would be extremely difficult to have the text that so well matches Abraham's day produced in any other than an inspired way and have such significant impact on Latter-day Saint thought. As Dr. Bennett discussed, our understanding of the pre-existence, our whole outlook on life as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is colored by this book of Scripture, and that's what's important about it. And the translation isn't so important, and nobody asks Egyptologists how they translate Egyptian texts, and I'm not sure that they would hold up any better.
And maybe just one thing, I would say, and very much agree, this is agreeing with both my colleagues here, I find it ironic that people will want to know more about the Book of Abraham, and they study all sorts of things except for the text of the Book of Abraham. If we are honest pursuers of truth, and I would encourage you to study all sorts of things, but that has to include equal amount of time for the text of the Book of Abraham. If you are not studying that text, you are not really trying to pursue truth or learn. If you're intellectually honest, you will read the scriptural text along with studying other things. And the power of the scriptural text, the way it matches not only with ancient things, but with God, that's important, and we can't ignore that part.
Well, thank you so much for what you just shared and the time you gave us for this discussion and what we talked about. It's really, really wonderful, and I appreciate your time and all the knowledge that you gave me and gave all of us. Thank you so much. Grazie per aver guardato questo video. Se ti interessa di più sull'argomento puoi guardare questi altri video e approfondire con altre fonti.